So some of you might have come here expecting to see Val Kilmer's Moses, maybe the Santa Clarita High School Marching Band, or perhaps Oates from Hall & Oates. What was Oates' first name from Hall & Oates? Who remembers? John. Good, there you go. It was in my head, and I was like, I have to look this up to make sure I'm accurate, but that's who it was. It was John Oates, rather. So that's Jeremy's humor. Jeremy's our communications director. He's incredible, but he sent out, I think, our first really fully tongue-in-cheek Purim circular. So sorry to disappoint you. All you're going to get is stern channeling King David in some way, shape, or form. And what I'm here to tell you is that when it comes to King David, no politician in all of history has ever had as effective, or has ever left as effective, as enduring, as influential legacy as King David. Now, here's what this is, sort of. It's kind of a cheap plug for the class I'm teaching. Tuesday night, 7:30, see you there. But it's also something to sort of pique your interest, because what am I doing talking about King David when actually the girl of the hour is Esther, right? It's her holiday on Saturday night. It's Purim. So what does King David have to do with the story of Purim? Watch how this happens. Now, first a little bit about David, to give you a sense of where we're going here. David's legacy didn't really only last his lifetime. In fact, it lasted decades. It lasted centuries. It lasted eons, longer than his life and than anyone who was alive to remember him could even talk about him. 3,000 years, that's a long time. So no politician could ever have a propaganda machine like that except for David. And my famous maxim, and whenever I teach about David or study David, when we read the Bible itself, is more often than not, it's all about David. More often than not, something in the Bible in some way is an oblique reference to King David and the way our tradition wants us to remember him and spin his life. So a quick review. As the Bible first tells it, David was a little more, not much more, than a mob boss. Think Tony Soprano. That's the best image to hold on to when you think of David. He ruled over, and the Bible even says this, he rules over a bunch of brigands and misfits and criminals. And the truth is, he usurped the throne of the king that preceded him. King Saul is his name. More about Saul later, because he plays into this story as well. And what David essentially did for Saul was to drive him into madness. Now, for Saul, granted, it wasn't a long trip, but David drove him pretty well. And what David came to rule was a very tiny kingdom, Jerusalem and its environs. Now, in the Bible's imagination, the Bible describes this immense kingdom. But the borders are constantly shifting with every chapter in the Bible you read about David's kingdom. So what we really think is it was just a little tiny area around Jerusalem, not much more than that. Now, in addition to that, David murdered another man to claim his wife after committing adultery with that same woman, Bathsheba. And as he approached death, he was an enfeebled old man, and he almost threw his family and his nation, that he was the patriarch of this great nation, he almost threw the nation into chaos because he had no succession plan. And it was only his wife who stepped up at the last minute and engineered things so that David's rather famous son, maybe you've heard of him, King Solomon, could step in and rule the kingdom and build the temple and do all the things that David didn't do in his lifetime. But here's the thing. Beyond that basic story, the outline of David's life, there are parts of the Bible that spin David's life to transform this Tony Soprano kind of a figure into one of the greatest Jewish king that ever existed. The importance of his dynasty is exaggerated. In fact, Israelite kings subsequent to David trace their lineage back to David, even though they had no connection to David's family. They made it up because it was so important to be connected to David. He's credited for writing most of the book of Psalms, even though some of the Psalms are written after his death. And the stories even, and this is too complicated to go into now, come to my class, you'll learn all about it. Oh, that's another plug, wasn't it? Okay. So you'll hear stories of Judah and stories of Abraham that were rewritten with an eye to the stories people were telling about how they were spinning David's life, believe it or not. And later generations took this image of David and connected him to the Messiah. So we all stand up at Havdalah, the ceremony of the end Shabbat, and we sing Eliyahu Hanavi. That's all about Who's the Messiah? An ancestor of David. He's going to come from David's line. So David, his influence exists even in our own time. But there's one story in the Bible, an example of ancient biblical spin, that's actually not to David's advantage, but it's in support of the king that he usurped, King Saul. And that story is Purim. Purim is actually an attempt by Saul's descendants to lift up Saul's reputation. So how does it work? Okay, so here's the first thing. I'm going to crush some people's notions of Purim, but hey, I take some perverse pleasure in doing that. It's long been established by historians that the book of Esther is a satirical farce, that it was written by Greek Jews to actually be a critique of a monarchy. And it was written by the Greek Jews, the Jews who were influenced by Greek culture, to actually make fun of the Persian court. They saw Persian kings from the perspective of, as Greek Jews, they saw them as effeminate and dandies, and that's why the only thing Ahasuerus does in this story is throw parties and get drunk. Because the Greeks looked down on the Persians. So we're reading that, and of course, in this generation, we don't even know from that, but that's what they were doing. And also, the story of Purim was probably meant, and it was a beautiful story, and it has this power to uplift the spirits of diaspora Jews. When you hear this story of Jews taking control of their own destiny and overcoming a mighty force, and you're subject to the oppression of whatever nation you're living in, this is a great story to read. And those random twists of fate that actually resulted in the victory of the Jewish people, well, many Jews can tell stories about their own lives and how random twists of fate and the unlikely events that occurred actually resulted in their lives being saved. But now, as I said, it's also an opportunity to lift up King Saul's reputation. Because Saul comes from the tribe of Benjamin. The 12 tribes, Saul's tribe is Benjamin. Now, which clearly, though not very significant to us because Benjamin is one of those lost tribes, it was very significant to the author of the story of Purim. And according to the story, Saul, King Saul, is a Benjaminite, as the story says. And also, Mordecai, in the story of Purim, is a descendant of the tribe of Benjamin. So Saul and Mordecai are linked through their descent from the same ancestor. And in fact, they're both related to one ancestor whose name is Kish. Kish is the ancestor of both Mordecai and Saul. Now, here's where the David connection comes in. When David was wandering through the land of Jerusalem, it said that a certain Kish came out and cursed David. Now, it's not good to curse the king, because what usually happens if you curse the king is you give up your life. Well, Kish came out and roundly cursed David, but David let Kish live. There's no explanation given for that in the Bible. So the rabbis came along and they said, the reason David let Kish, this Benjaminite, live is because David knew through the miraculous gift of prophecy that Kish would give rise to Mordecai, who would save the Jews. That's what the rabbis said. Now, of course, Esther is Mordecai's niece, so she's also a Benjaminite. So now we have a hero and a heroine of our story, both of them descended from Saul's tribe, the Benjaminites. But wait, there's more. Haman is known as an Agagite, related to the people of Agag, the king of Agag. Who was Agag? Agag was the very king that Saul was supposed to destroy. But Saul didn't destroy Agag. Saul, in fact, let Agag live, and because of that, the Bible says, the kingship, the monarchy, was stripped from his hands. And also, when the people defeated Agag, they took the spoil from the town. They were specifically instructed not to do that, but they did it, and they were punished for doing that. So they took the bounty and the booty from the town. So from taking all of this and putting it together, here's what Purim does. Agag, this king, is said to be, of course, as I said, Haman's ancestor. But the very one who brings about the final downfall of this lineage from Agag to Haman is, of course, the ancestor of Saul, the Benjaminite, Mordecai. And Esther bring down finally Agag. And what they achieve, not only destroying Haman and his son, so there's no offspring, but they also, when the Jews fight back against the Persians, they don't take booty from the towns that they conquer. So they're undoing the sin that Saul did his generations going forward. The Bible loves this kind of intergenerational payback and this kind of intergenerational adherence to the practices and the laws. So this forgotten monarch, Saul, is lifted up in the story of Purim in this one book we read. So now, there are no Benjaminites around today to revel in the story of this final victory. But there were when the book was written, and this book was their last chance to lift up their family's reputation. So why do you need to know this? You might be asking yourself. So here's the first reason you need to know this. The Bible is a beautifully complex book. And the more we study it, the more you learn about how these stories are so interrelated, and we get inside the minds of our ancestors, and that in itself is a fascinating excursion into their thoughts, into their thinking, and into how they sought to shape the world. But there's another reason. Because what this tells us in some ways is that the more things change, the more they stay the same. Think about this. Have you ever been to a presidential library? Every single presidential library whitewashes the history of the president that is the namesake for that library. There's not one presidential library in the country that really lifts up the shortcomings of the particular president. It's a whitewash. But all of this kind of serves as sort of a warning, if you will, that we'd like to think that the study of history, whether it's the history of last week or the last century, is somehow or another a dispassionate collection of events that occurred in the past. But here's the truth. Not only is history written by the victors, but history is also a reflection of the priorities and agenda of whoever is writing the history at the particular moment. History is shaped by the authors of history. And it's on us, as consumers of that information, whoever is giving us history, whoever is feeding it to us, to ask ourselves the same questions I asked about the story that I just told you about Haman and Esther and King Saul. Who's telling the story? What's the agenda of the storyteller? And how might someone else tell the story differently under different circumstances? So that's the lesson from this hidden twist in the Purim story. Esther may be fantasy, but the message of Purim isn't. Esther and Mordecai might have gotten the ball rolling, but that last chapter, the one that's usually left out of Purim plays in synagogues, is all about the Jews fighting back, all about the Jews saving themselves, teaching the listener that in truth, we have to be our own agents. We have to act on our own behalf. We're not passive drifters through time. We have to be active agents in events. And it's imperative for us to be effective active agents, to be students of the past, to learn its lessons, and to apply them to our own day. When you walked in, we sang a beautiful passage from the book of Esther. So important that it finds its way into the Havdalah ceremony. It's a song about light, and it promises the Jews that they'll have light in their lives, and it hopes for light in our lives. La Yehudim hayta ora v'simcha v'sason v'ikar. The Jews enjoyed light and gladness, happiness, and honor. And what it says to us is that when the night is dark, it's on us to learn the lessons of the past and to reach out to one another in the light, to learn the lessons from our past and seek the good of our community. Ultimately, it is upon us to spread the light. Amen.